when I was asked the question, or the candidates were asked the question, if you are successful, how are you going to promote equality, diversity and inclusion in the profession, or words to that effect? And I was the second person to answer, and I was the only person of colour on that panel, looking out at my fellow colleagues thinking, how am I going to answer this question? And, I answered it very quickly, perhaps too quickly for the compere. And I said, how am I going to promote equality, diversity and inclusion in the profession? I'm going to role model it. I'm going to be visible. And I promised the Law Society two things, or I promised them many things, but above all, two things. I told them that I'd be visible and I'd take them to places that they'd never been.
I'm Jack Newton, CEO of Clio, and this is the Daily Matters podcast. On Daily Matters, we talk with legal professionals, industry leaders, and subject matter experts about the future of law. We explore where the legal industry is headed, how legal practice is changing, and what you can be doing to position yourself for success. Today's guest is Stephanie Boyce, the Deputy Vice President of the Law Society of England and Wales. Later this year, Stephanie will be sworn in as Vice President, and in 2021, she will become the first Black, Asian, or minority ethnic person to ever serve as the Law Society's President. Stephanie, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Stephanie, to start off, I'd love for you to tell us briefly about yourself and your career thus far.
So absolutely. So I qualified as a solicitor in 2002. I began my career in private practice, but was made redundant twice in as many years due to the decline then in publicly funded work. So I decided to move in-house into a business rather than the traditional private practice firm that solicitors tend to work within here. And my move for going in-house was the fact that I was attracted by the opportunity to work more flexibly and to be closer to the decision-making process. And I went in at a time in 2004 when going in-house wasn't really talked about as much. And certainly routes into the profession weren't clear. And when I told my first recruitment agent that I wanted to work in the city, i.e. the City of London, I was told I wasn't being realistic. So getting my first job in the city at the General Counsel of the Bar, and the General Counsel of the Bar, better known as the Bar Council, is the organisation that looks after the other arm of the legal profession, i.e. barristers. So I joined the Bar Council as a solicitor to the then Complaints Commissioner. And for me, joining the Bar Council was a real coup. So I've had a varied career, moving in-house, working for accountants, moving very quickly into the governance sphere, which is my absolute specialism. And I've done a master's in public law and global governance with King's College at the University of London, where I suspect that my appetite for governance started to form. So I'm also a fellow of the governance, the Chartered Governance Institute here in the United Kingdom.
And when you become you're Deputy Vice President of the Law Society today, and next year you're going to become the first person from an ethnic minority to become President of the Law Society. So number one, congratulations on that. And I'm curious, what was it like? How did you feel when you found out that you had been elected?
Well, firstly, it's a remarkable achievement, an absolute privilege to hold this position. And, to put it into context, and you touched on this earlier, but to put it into context, I will become the 6th female president and the first Black ethnic minority president in the 195-year history of the Law Society of England and Wales. So when I found out that I had been elected after 4 attempts at trying, I cried tears of joy. It still takes my breath away now. The announcement is traditionally done by the CEO, who will call you up, call all the candidates to deliver the news, calling the successful candidate first. And I had been on a panel that day at the Law Society with a fellow candidate, and I could hear footsteps outside the door, but the panel I was on was overrunning. It was getting later in the day, about 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, walking up Chancery Lane, the street upon which the Law Society has its headquarters. And I took the call from the CEO, and it was just general chit-chat to start with. And then he said, "I've got something to tell you." And I took a deep breath and I said, "Okay." And he said, "You've done it." And it just, the tears just started rolling, took my breath away. And as I say, it's a remarkable achievement to serve my profession.
And I'd love to hear a bit more about why you were so driven to achieve this position. Taking 4 runs at something is really significant. This shows a lot of tenacity, and this is obviously something you wanted at a deep level. Tell me a bit more about that.
I had a dream. I absolutely had a dream, and I was determined. I knew I was just as capable, just as qualified, just as experienced as anybody else who'd held that position. But I was told by fellow colleagues, "Stephanie, go home and rest. You're embarrassing yourself now, having trying my 4th time. Never in our lifetime will we see an ethnic minority become president of this law society." But, Jack, the more they told me I couldn't, was the more I was determined that I could. And so for me, the first 3 attempts were lessons learned. So, because for me, it wasn't in the knockbacks, it was how did I rise when I fell? And I refined, I honed my skill set and my knowledge. And I remember sat the night after hustings, because we have to do hustings as well. And hustings, perhaps if your audience isn't aware, is where all the candidates give a speech, and then we face a number of questions from the audience and some pre-written questions, none of which we've had in advance. And the day following hustings, I remember a former president sat next to me and he said to me, "You must be quietly confident you've got this in the bag." And I turned to him and I said to him, "I've been quietly confident every single time." So such was, my belief. And, to take us back to hustings, when I was asked the question, or the candidates were asked the question, if you are successful, how are you going to promote equality, diversity, and inclusion in the profession, or words to that effect? And I was the second person to answer, and I was the only person of colour on that panel, looking out at my fellow colleagues thinking, how am I going to answer this question? And, I answered it very quickly, perhaps too quickly for the compare. And I said, how am I going to promote equality, diversity, and inclusion in the profession? I'm going to role model it. I'm going to be visible. And I promised the Law Society 2 things, or I promised them many things, but above all, 2 things. I told them that I'd be visible and I'd take them to places that they'd never been. So for me, it's absolutely about resilience. And I just kept going. And to tell you the truth, I would have kept going a 5th, a 6th, a 7th time, because such was the belief in my determination to succeed.
Well, once again, congratulations. And that's truly an inspirational story. When you look back at your 3 failed attempts, what did you learn from those experiences, and how did they inform how you approached your 4th attempt? Do you feel like you approached the challenge differently, or do you think something had shifted in the macro environment that helped see you get elected the 4th go round?
Well, for me, nothing comes before its time. So, and I don't necessarily look at the previous 3 as failures. It just wasn't my time.
Right.
And, I'm an absolute subscriber to law of attraction, positiveness. And so, as I say, those were stepping stones, building blocks. It was me flexing my muscles, increasing my strength. I read more. I spoke to people more. I just absolutely immersed myself. I approached it as if I was studying for an exam. You know, covered every single topic because the Law Society covers, we are a diverse profession in terms of where we practice, what type of law we practice. So you did not know in which question you could be asked. You had to know everything. And you had to respond in a way that brought everyone with you. So people didn't think, oh, that person is only going to advocate for one particular sector or division or whatever. You had to be able to bring everyone with you. And that was done through speaking to people. And as I say, I approached it as if I was studying for an exam. I read everything, read, watched everything.
And for our audience, that we do have an international audience, but the majority of our audience is American. Law societies bear many resemblances to bar associations, but they are different in some ways. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about what holding the office of president of the Law Society means in general, and in particular for you. What does holding this position mean for you?
Well, I've made history to start with. My brother said to me the other day, he says, "Sis, do you realize that they'll be reading about you long after you've gone?" So what does it mean? It's an ambassadorial position. Traditionally, 5 days a month of your time is devoted to being deputy vice president. But for me, I stepped aside from practice very early on to devote all of my time, my full time, to this role, because such was the belief in this position. As I say, it's a remarkable position to get out and represent your profession, advocate for it, speak on behalf of it, influence. We have a unique relationship with government where we do seek to influence. We're apolitical, so we're neutral when it comes to politics, and enjoy a very good relationship with the three major parties, which in this country is the Conservative, who are currently in government, the opposition party Labour, and the Liberal Democrats, the third biggest party. And what we do is that we try and lobby and influence in terms of where we see areas within our profession perhaps are struggling, or indeed we have a public interest role as well. And that is to promote the rule of law and to ensure that the public has access to justice. And of course, in these current times, having access to justice is more important than ever. As we've seen, certainly in this country, we saw our courts close. Our courts are starting to slowly open up. But to put it into context for you, we have about 500,000 or so backlog of cases in the criminal justice system that one newspaper, a major newspaper, reported will perhaps take 5 years to clear.
Wow.
So, you know, justice not only must be seen to be done, it must be done, and it must be done fairly. And if you're looking at 500,000, almost 500,000 cases, 5 years to clear, you know, on both sides, whether you're the defendant, whether you're the victim, you know, can justice really be served?
Stephanie, something I'd love to spend a bit of time on is in your path to becoming president of the Law Society. It's obviously been an interesting path for you. There's a video interview you did for a project that was celebrating 100 years of women in law in the UK. And you commented that you did face obstacles as a woman, but that it's difficult to talk about obstacles as a woman without talking about the obstacles as a Black woman. And you said those obstacles actually drove to help you succeed in your career. Can you walk us through some of your experiences and some of the obstacles you did overcome over the course of your career?
I mean, absolutely. If I may first, so the 100 Years Project, a remarkable project that was put together to celebrate the removal of the Sex Disqualification Act of 2019 in this country. And we celebrated that in December 2019. Sorry, Sex Disqualification Act of 1919, and we celebrated that in 2019.
And what can you tell us more about that act?
So essentially, that act was a remarkable act, but it gave women the right to to enter the legal profession, other notable professions, accountancy, veterinarians, and so forth. But you know, after long years of campaigning, women were able to, as I say, join the legal profession. Although it wasn't till 1922 that we would see our first woman qualify as a solicitor. And there were 4 candidates to be admitted, and that was decided as to who was going to be the first to be admitted as a solicitor was decided, if the folk tale is to be believed, by a race down Chancery Lane, and whoever won that race was the first person to be admitted as a solicitor, Carrie Morrison. So a remarkable act, as I say, that really liberated and opened up the professions for women. So the 100 Years Project marked that, and they approached me very early on to ask me, would I be involved in that project? And that was a video biography and a series of video biographies of other notable females, and which was also followed up by a book. But quite right, when people ask me to talk about the obstacles that I face as a woman, it is absolutely difficult for me to talk about obstacles as a woman without talking about obstacles as a Black woman. You know, each and every one of us faces and will face challenges at some point in our lives. And whilst the challenges that I have faced may be different than that of others, each and every one of us wants the same thing, and that is equality of opportunity and to be treated fairly and equitably within the law. And the challenges that I have faced have shaped me into the person I am today, the person I'm seeking to become. And as a woman of colour, a Black woman, I did not take no for an answer. I pushed and pushed and kept pushing. For me, I pushed, and that is, I persevered until something happened. And as I say, it took me 4 attempts to become Deputy Vice President of the Law Society in England and Wales. And as I say, when everybody told me it's never going to happen, I didn't give up, and I wouldn't have given up, because I knew, as I said, that I was just as capable, qualified as anyone else who had held that position before. So for me, you have to be in it to win it. You have to keep going. And that's how change comes about, by being part of the change that you want to see. And sometimes that means sticking your head above the parapet and being strong and the odd one out, but it means that you have to, as I say, be in it to win it.
Over the past few weeks, the topics of systemic racism, police misconduct, and justice reform have been at the forefront of social discussion, and rightly so. Most of our audience is based in North America, as I mentioned earlier. Can you shed some light on what things have been like in Britain? And I'm also curious, I know you did some of your schooling in the US, maybe some of the macro level differences you might see as it relates to these issues in the US versus Britain.
I mean, Britain certainly has been showing its support for Black Lives Matter movement with gatherings, marches, and outpourings of shared experiences and support for the calls for change that are taking place in the US and around the world. One could not but be touched by the abhorrent tragedy around George Floyd's death, which caused outrage and empathy wherever you are in the world. But what that did was absolutely mobilize and mobilize people here from all backgrounds into speaking out against injustice and inequality, from gatherings showing support to high profile figures speaking out and sharing experiences. You would have seen perhaps Lewis Hamilton, our most successful Formula One racing driver, you know, football players, you know, speaking out as they call for further review and access on justice reform to ensure equality before and within the law for all. The reality in Britain is that if you happen to be Black, you are perhaps more likely not to have gone to university. You are more likely to be caught up in the criminal justice system. 1 in 5 times more likely to be tasered by the police, and more likely to be or come from a disadvantaged background. It's important that we all, and I think what the Black Lives Matter movement has shown is that enough is enough. It's time for concerted action. And certainly in terms of what's gone on in America and how that compares, whilst perhaps we don't have a policeman putting his knee on our necks, the difficulty is that where people don't feel that they are treated equitably and fairly, that is perhaps the two things that the commonality that binds people together. This gives us an optimum chance to affect change, real change, and start to move the discussion forward, but to take real action. And certainly from the legal profession's perspective, that covers, as I say, not only the solicitor's profession, the barrister profession, the judiciary and so forth, because our judiciary is not diverse here. And there have been a number of initiatives over the years to try and increase diversity amongst the judiciary, because it must be that we must reflect the society we seek to serve. And so it is, this gives us a real opportunity to step up those concerted efforts to increase diversity and inclusion.
So I'd love to dig into that topic, Stephanie, about specifically in the legal industry. Where do things stand in terms of equity, diversity, and inclusion? You commented to the effect that we've got a long way to go. And that's underscored with some data that the Law Society has generated through a comprehensive survey that it did back in 2018. Can you speak a little bit to some of the findings of that survey and delve a bit deeper into the thoughts you just shared in terms of why diversity is so important?
Well, absolutely. So the survey that I think you're speaking about is the Women in Law survey.
That's
so
right.
Yes, so women currently make up about, depending on which figures on which day, but around about just under 52% of the solicitor profession at the moment. So we are in the majority. 100 years later, we have made it into the majority, into the profession. But of course, what we're not doing is we're not staying in the profession, and we're not reaching the senior positions in the profession. And if you then add in intersectionality into that, and what I mean by intersectionality, if you start to add in additional characteristics into that factor, such as whether that's race, disability, sexuality, so forth, the findings become even more eye-watering. So the previous president, Christina Blacklaws, undertook a Women in Law survey, and she took that not only nationally, but she took it globally. And basically, what that survey found was that the profession had made great progress, but there's still a long way to go. Christina undertook approximately 250 roundtable discussions across 5 continents within 21 jurisdictions in 30 cities, involving approximately 5,000 women and men in the profession. And the research identified that the key obstacles to women's career include unconscious bias. 52% of those surveyed cited unconscious bias. However, only 11% said that unconscious bias was consistently carried out in the organisation. So an overwhelmingly 91% of respondents to the survey cited flexible working as crucial to improving diversity. And of course, COVID-19 has managed to do in 48 hours what the legal profession perhaps would have taken, parts of the legal profession would have taken 10 years to do. And that is for us to work flexibly. So just to give you a little bit more data, when we start looking at BAME solicitors in the profession, and where the Law Society is about to conduct further research into
sorry to interrupt, Stephanie. BAME is a bit of a UK-specific acronym. Can you explain what that means for us?
My apologies. So BAME, which is a very controversial acronym at the moment, because there are calls to replace it with something perhaps more fitting. So at the moment, BAME stands for Black, Asian, Minority, Ethnic. And that is how, that is the term that is used to describe those of us from an ethnic minority background at the moment. But as I say, there is also a movement to try and get that terminology shifted. So BAME solicitors make up about 17% or so, between 17 to 21% of the profession. And to put that into context, Black solicitors make up about 2.1% of the solicitor profession, and 3% of the UK population following the last census in 2011. So, you know, in terms of an Asian solicitor is about 9% of the profession. So there's a long way to go in terms of diversifying the profession. In terms of, so we've kind of got the gender balance, but we haven't got the equality when it comes to equality of opportunity if you happen to be female. And as I say, if you happen to have other characteristics, and if you then build in sexuality and disability, those figures get even worse.
And can you talk about some of the ways, you know, as you become president and you see some of the opportunities for change, how do you see COVID-19 as having accelerated some of the change that you believe is actually driving women and potentially other groups out of the profession? You made a comment that, you know, overnight, and I agree wholeheartedly with you, by the way, overnight we saw more flexibility, more technological change happen in the legal profession than we might have seen otherwise in a decade. And I think at least amongst the courts, change that may have never happened. And I'm curious in what ways, you know, despite the, you know, steep humanitarian toll that COVID-19 has exacted, there are reasons to be optimistic this has actually had, you know, positive impact on some parts of society and some parts of the legal system. Can you comment on your observations on that front?
Absolutely. So in terms of the economic impact in this country, we've only seen round about a 4.9% drop off in legal services. What we did see very early on so in this country, we went into lockdown, as we call it, on the 23rd of March. On the 23rd of March, the government was very clear and told us we were to stay home and we were not to go out unless, of course, we were permitted to go out for 1 hour per day for exercise and to only go to the shops, the supermarket for essentials. Other than that, we were to stay home. And we took that literally. So one of the things we've enjoyed is the fact that, you know, nature, birds we haven't seen in years, flowers, you know, the air has been clearer, less cars on the road. But of course, what that meant was that people weren't spending money. They weren't, and what spending money translates into the legal profession, they weren't, so the conveyancing market, i.e. the property market, shut down here. The government unequivocally said, if you are in the middle of a transaction, i.e. you are in the middle of moving home, please have a discussion amongst yourself and, you know, see if you can put that off, stop home. In fact, my own home was on the market and I had accepted an offer the Friday before we went into lockdown. And of course, that the rest is history. But so the conveyancing market, the property market came to a full halt. So did jury trials in our criminal system. You know, jury trials is at the cornerstone of our democracy, the fairness of our justice system, to be judged, by your peers. That all came to a halt. Immigration work. Some areas were thriving, such as employment law, wills and probate, but the rest of that came to a halt. And whilst parts of our economy is starting to open up, and the housing market opened up a month or so ago, there's been a lot of transactions that have been lost in the lockdown COVID implication. I spoke about the effect on the criminal justice system with the backlog of cases before. Not all of our courts have opened up. The Justice Secretary, the Attorney General are trying to find ways to get us back to working, and in fact has looked at ways of working to conduct jury trials, such as that undertaken in the Second World War, where we only had, instead of 12 jurors, we had 7. There is talk of emergency legislation being introduced in the next coming weeks as a permanent measure with a sunset clause, and a sunset clause being that only for a limited period of time, and this must be reviewed, that we proceed with criminal trials without a jury. The President, Simon Davis, of the Law Society of England and Wales, has come out and spoken very clearly that we are not in favour of having no jury trials. It is right, and it is right that you are judged, as I say, by your peers if justice is to be done and seen to be done. So that takes us on to technology. Technology has played a vast role in getting us all through COVID. The fact that I'm sat here talking to you now, and we're miles away, different continents away. Technology is good when it works. It is good when you can afford it, when you have the skills to work it, and the hardware and the infrastructure. One of the things that we've seen with COVID, and no doubt perhaps you've had this experience as well, is that as we've all been at home, so I'm supposed to have super fast fiber optic broadband, but I think it's got a touch of COVID because as we've all been at home, it's slowed down. I've got about 4 devices around me at the moment. Forget what else is going on in the house. So and because we're all in working from home, it's been a drain on the system. So not everything works when you want it to work. But what we have seen is where firms have said, we need you in the office. They've had to allow staff to work from home because the government is still telling us that you only go into work if it is absolutely necessary and you cannot work from home. So the default position is that we're all at home for the moment. So we've seen technology play a vast role. So for the Law Society, all our face-to-face events have been cancelled until later this year, possibly into 2021. But what we have seen is more engagement, greater engagement when we deliver webinars and so forth online. But our concern remains for the judiciary, where we have seen some hearings taking place remotely, is that, to give an example, where you have a couple who have been locked down in the same house, who are in the middle of a divorce, and they are to attend a hearing online. And perhaps, trying to have legal advice, take legal advice when your partner is sat next to you or in the next room. The other thing, of course, is that what we're hearing on the ground is, going back to the point that I made about resources, is that if you cannot afford, we've heard about people having to pay to top up their phone so they can get the data on their phone in order to appear before the court. We've heard of a lack of consistency amongst our members as to different courts applying remote working and rules differently. And the biggest thing, of course, is that, especially for a jury trial, you want to be the defendant, the jury wants to be able to see witnesses, the defendant and so forth. You want to see their body language, their facial expression. And, seemingly at the same time, the defendant wants to be able to confer with his legal representative, whether that's passing a note, whether that's, saying something because somebody has said something. And technology doesn't always allow you that privacy or to do that. So technology, the point I'm making is technology is a great thing. It can speed up justice, but it must be that justice, as I say, is not only seen to be done, it must be done fairly. And it must be, at the moment we have a consent, where you consent to doing things. If you appear before, say, the Employment Tribunal, it's by consent, but not necessarily in other parts of the justice system do we see that consent in place.
So Stephanie, I'd like to wrap up with a big question, and the data shows us, what we see in the industry shows us that there's a long way to go when it comes to true diversity and inclusion in the legal industry. And I know there's people listening that want to drive change just don't know how to do it? How do you actually realize the change that we all want to see in the industry? How do you go about on the ground increasing diversity and increasing inclusion in your law firm? Can you talk about some of the strategies that you recommend and advocate for? And if we're successful in doing this, where you hope this carries the industry over the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, absolutely. Where I hope it carries the industry is increased representation at all levels of the profession, regardless of ethnicity, gender, religion, or socio-economical background. The closing of the gender and ethnicity pay gap, to allow equal pay for equal work. Change ways of working to allow for progression for all members of the profession, taking into account different constraints and responsibilities to allow the best candidates to thrive, are some of the ways to achieve the aim of a truly diverse and inclusive profession. But it's about talking. It's about speaking up, sharing best practices. So one of the things that we are doing currently and will be doing is roundtables, where we're asking our members of different sizes, different sectors or practices to get together and discuss their shared experience and what they do, how they do it, and take the best from that and move forward. And we're going to do so in collaboration with other parts of the legal profession to, as I say, really show that we are truly serious about affecting change, because there's no point talking about it if you're going to do nothing about it.
Well, thanks so much for joining us this morning, Stephanie. I've really enjoyed our conversation. So many valuable insights, and excited to see the impact you have as president. And congratulations again on making history. It's a momentous achievement and one that you are rightfully proud of.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Jack.
Thanks for joining us on Daily Matters, a podcast from Clio. Rate and review wherever you get your podcasts, and subscribe so that you never miss an episode. Daily Matters is produced by Andrew Booth, Sam Rosenthal, and Derek Boland, and hosted by yours truly, Jack Newton. Thanks also to Clio, the world's leading cloud-based legal technology provider, for supporting this podcast.